Well, hello and welcome back to the Conflict Skills Podcast. I'm your host, professional mediator Simon Good. I set up this podcast to provide free resources and tools for dealing with conflict, so if that sounds like the kind of thing that's useful for you, please consider pressing subscribe. In the episode today, I'm going to be talking about how you can analyze workplace conflict strategically. I'll describe some of the steps that I use when I'm analysing conflict situations, and I suppose in a way this can almost form a step-by-step toolkit that you can apply whether you're dealing with a conflict situation yourself or maybe in a situation where you're supporting somebody else. Actually, I was doing a conflict resolution training workshop in this past week, and I had the director of a reasonably large construction company attending, and he was talking about one of the things that he really took away from the session was wanting to help his team almost, I suppose, focus on responding to conflict rather than reacting. And in his mind, one of the keys that would help him to do that was analysing conflict, like sitting down on a situation by situation basis and thinking about what's at stake, what's important, and then developing a plan. Now, I was talking about a particular tool, the 5 types of conflict. I've described that in previous episodes of the podcast, and I'll talk about that today as well as one of the stages that we'll use. But I'll also talk about some of the other, I don't know what you would call them, like frameworks or lenses or theories or whatever. Like when I do conflict resolution training, I often use PowerPoint slides and, I'll put up a slide that says something like, this is one way to think about the circles of control and what are the things that are completely within your control, what can you influence, and what are the things outside of your control that you can just accept. So it's like this visual representation of something that actually probably we all even realize at a subconscious level, but seeing it on the page or on the screen, so to speak, it helps us almost to think differently about, a situation that we're in, like to not take it as personally, for example, if we're not able to help. It's almost like sometimes we need to help our brain to become aware of something. So as I go through some of the different tools in the episode today, my hope is both that you'll be able to find some practical benefit in applying them, like taking these literally and using them in your day-to-day work. But I also expect that maybe hearing me or other people talk about things like communication or conflict, I think sometimes that gradual increase in awareness actually has a lot of tangible benefits, even if you don't end up like intending to do something different tomorrow, if you know what I mean. Just thinking about situations differently often helps us not to take it as personally and maybe to develop more creative options for dealing with an issue, especially if it's something recurring that we were feeling a little bit stuck about. So the different steps that I'll talk about, and probably the factors that I think comprise that conflict analysis toolkit predominantly, are a self-assessment and then steps including self-regulation if that's what's needed. Thinking about your goal, I'll talk about some of the ways that you can reflect on that. I'll talk about the circle of influence or the circle of control and some of the ways that we can consider our options and maybe some of the things that we wish were different. Actually, there's not a whole lot we can do about right now, and it's not going to be very productive for us to spend our time ruminating and thinking about that, especially if it's a pattern that we're slipping into. I'll describe those 5 types of conflict, which helps to give us information about the factors that are driving a situation and helps us then to refine and develop options for dealing with it. I'll explain some individual personality differences that we might consider, and then finally what are called conflict modes or conflict styles. This is really helpful in a conflict analysis perspective because it helps us to be aware of our own default reactions for dealing with conflict, like maybe you're a natural people pleaser, for example, which in the conflict mode framework would fit into the accommodating category. And so that might be useful to just pause and be aware of so that you don't jump into a knee-jerk reaction of people pleasing if that's not the ideal option for this conflict. But it also, I think, can prepare us for the likely experience that we're going to have dealing with this person. Like if they're a natural competitor and they're, it's a my way or the highway type of person, then it might be best that in this next conversation that I have with them, that I hold the line and I'm more assertive and I take more of a competing approach if that's what I expect from them. Because if I go in my natural, I want to collaborate or compromise or whatever, and they're competing, it's likely that I'll give away more than I should, agree to something that I regret down the track. So pausing and thinking about how are they likely to react helps us to prepare. And those 5 different conflict modes or conflict styles, I think in a way that almost also represents the 5 different options that we have for dealing with a conflict situation that we're encountering. So those are the different steps that I'll go through. And as I mentioned, the starting point for me, and often when I'm coaching other people, is self-awareness and self-regulation. So here I'm really asking myself questions like, how am I traveling? What's sitting there for me? What's the level of stress? What are the emotions that I'm experiencing? And even what's going on in my body. Am I noticing that my perception has been adjusted, or I'm shaking or pacing back and forth or tapping the pen on the desk or whatever? And even physically, what am I noticing? Maybe I feel my stomach churning or real tightness in my shoulders or whatever. These can all be signs of escalation. As we move into this more escalated state, it's often in response to threat, particularly in a context involving conflict. And that's things like physical threat, but non-physical threats as well, like being embarrassed or feeling criticized, or a high level of uncertainty, especially when there's a lot at stake for you, worrying that, other people are talking about you behind your back, or something's going wrong that you should be fixing right now or dealing with. Those kind of things make us feel more hypervigilant over time. And that escalation process tends to occur at those 5 different levels. Our thoughts as we become more escalated, become quicker and more frenetic and frazzled. We look at situations in more of a black and white way and lose perspective on the peripheral vision or the detail involved. Like we think, I'm such an idiot, I always mess up those presentations. Everyone laughed at me when I messed my notes. Like when we lose track of the fact that was just 30 seconds at the beginning, and actually for the last 45 minutes it all went really well. So our thinking patterns change, our emotions change, we experience very strong emotions, often anger or distress, come along with conflict. Our perception is altered, we ruminate and obsess about things that have been threats, like an argument that happened that day at work, or this annoying thing that the person said, or this meeting that's coming up. Our volition changes, our action, our voice becomes quivering, it could be those kind of things, but you might find yourself just walking over to the fridge and grabbing some chocolate, or pressing purchase on that thing that you've been resisting buying online because your willpower is at its lowest. And then all of these things also manifest in physical changes. The chemical hormone that our body releases is cortisol. It stays in our system for a very long time, like up to 18 hours. So this increased level of cortisol makes us feel on edge, makes us feel more agitated, makes it challenging to sleep or to concentrate, etc. So that's the starting point, is just to ask myself, where am I at? Like, it's not a forensic scientific diagnosis that is needed. A lot of the time it's just saying, like, how am I traveling? How worked up am I right now? How revved up am I? Just how tight, how frazzled am I feeling? And what do I need? And there are particular things that you can do in the moment to help regulate your nervous system. Breathing is an incredibly effective tool. I really like the piston breathing, I can't remember the phrasing that Andrew Huberman uses. I think it's the physiological sigh or something like that. The idea is that you breathe in and then pause during the inhale, and then continue to breathe in, and then finally breathe out all of the way out. That breath out is the most important part of the breath cycle. Really concentrate on fully emptying your lungs. It's more effective if you use your nose rather than your mouth. So, breathing really slowly out through your nose, emptying your lungs. It creates a lot of physical space in our chest. Some people feel almost a tingling sensation at that point where they've really breathed out all of the way. And it interrupts that automatic ramping up of our breath in the fight or flight response, the short, rapid breathing that we would go into if we needed to prepare for physical activity like defending ourselves, fight or flight if someone's going to attack us. Our body still gets ready for that same response simply through that process that we've learnt through evolution of this is what's typically useful for dealing with threats. So when I'm feeling worked up about something like workplace conflict, what would you say? It's like the adaptive response that my body and brain are using, it's just not the right fit. So I need to play the role of an adult and calming down my childish brain when it tends to want to panic or continually remind me about this thing that it thinks is a threat. It's like, yeah, okay, I remember that conversation. I remember that happened. They're not here right now. I don't need to talk to them. This isn't the time to think about it. In fact, if I keep thinking about it, it's going to really make it difficult to sleep. Let me do a quick meditation or go and have a bath or have a shower and put cold water at the end, or go for a run, hang out with someone who gives me energy and fills up my cup again. What are the kinds of things that you need to do to self-regulate? And that could be in the moment if you're in the middle of a difficult conversation. Breathing is one that really works for a lot of people, one tool. Adjusting your posture, lowering your shoulders, raising your chin, sitting back in your chair. It might be using a mindfulness technique like engaging your senses. What's 3 things that you can see, 2 things that you can smell, 1 thing that you can hear. Even just concentrating on your breath and what's the temperature of the air coming in and out of your nostrils. Is it warm or cool? Which bits of your chest are moving as you're breathing? Which bits of your back are touching your chair? Wiggling your toes and feeling the feeling of your socks in your socks in your shoes, It's so funny when someone asks us the question, like, what is your tongue doing in your mouth? We can remember it, like we're aware of it immediately. I know what my tongue's doing. I can feel it. And I suppose I could probably feel it 5 seconds ago, but my perception just wasn't paying attention to it. So as we escalate, as we become more, fight or flight oriented, our perception shifts. And if you can imagine a bear's chasing you, what's it good for your perception to focus on? It's 100% the bear. And I don't need a fine-grained level of detail. I don't need to know, its left paw looks a little bit sore. I wonder if it's favoring that. It might be a little bit better for me in terms of survival to dash to the left rather than the right. That's not how it works. We are just like, I need to get out of here. I need to escape. And we don't think very clearly about, our environment and the context and the consequences of our actions even. So slowing down our perception in that deliberate way of focusing on your tongue or your toes or your breath or your chest or your posture, it simply slows down that ramping up, the knee-jerk reaction that our brain goes into in response to perceived threat. So what do you need in the moment, and what do you need that evening? That would be the other thing I would consider. After a really busy day, when you've been dealing with emergencies and putting out fires, what do you need to do to bring that nervous system back into balance? And it might be discharging some of the buildup of kinetic energy, like doing exercise, for example, or it might be calming yourself down deliberately, like something that's physically relaxing, or a meditation, or cooking with some nice music on instead of watching a show, just so that your brain's not multitasking and switching between a million things. Like, think about what do you need in that moment. The next thing that we could consider is our goal. What is the likely ongoing relationship between you and the other person? And that, I think, helps us to consider things like, how important is it that you keep them happy? And that's not always equal, you know what I mean? Like, there'll be some staff within an organization that are more vital and important and you don't want to lose at any costs, and other people that you might like them and they're pretty good staff, but just from a pragmatic perspective, they're more easily replaced. The same could be said for your client list. Like, not all clients are of equal value to you, or it might be that they are of equal value, but they don't all require equal work. And once we can pause and remember that actually this has been a relationship that's been on the rocks a couple of times before, so maybe it's not just something connected to this issue that we're dealing with right now. It might be a pattern of something to do with that client. Or maybe we might consider things like a cost-benefit analysis and just how much time and resources is this particular client taking and dealing with this conflict. Although I know what they are asking for, and I might even have options for keeping them happy and coming up with a win-win kind of arrangement, I need to pause and actually think about, is this my goal right now? Maybe I'm dealing with a team who are short-staffed and we've got a whole bunch of new projects that are just about to begin. So if the client ended up choosing to go to someone else, for their services, maybe that's not actually the end of the world. In the short term, it sucks to lose clients, but given where everything else is happening right now, or new business coming through the pipeline, or it's an overall strategy that you wanted to diversify the mix of clients anyway, then maybe there's some silver lining, or from your perspective, this might be more of a neutral situation where, although it seems like a bit of a catastrophe, losing a client, it might be that in reality it's not as bad as we think. But what is important is that we pause and actually consider it. Because if not, if we don't pause and think about the goal, what's likely to happen is that we go into our default autopilot way of dealing with conflict. So if that's to compete, we might say no. I know in construction, that's a very common situation. You've got people within your business and they're holding the line, they're being very assertive, but they're not choosing strategically when to do it. Why didn't you just give them what they're asking for? That's not in the contract. They're not entitled to that. And I know a lot of senior managers are saying to their staff, like, keep them happy. It's not like the customer is always right and we should always give them everything, but there's something to be said for just being low touch and low problems and no worries, we can get that sorted. Especially if that's a repeat client and someone where there's a high potential for future work, it might be that even though they're technically not entitled to it or we're not obliged to give it or whatever, maybe there's some reason why that would still make strategic sense. So we need to pause and consider the goal. For me, when I'm coaching people, I often ask them questions around this goal, like, I've just got an email from this client, I'm so upset about this. It sounds like they're expecting this and they're even threatening this, but they've got no right, they've got no idea how much work we've put in or something like that. Like we could ask them a question about the goal there and say, I'm wondering if that's the priority right now, is maybe clarifying their understanding of the situation, or do you think there are other things that need to be dealt with first? So I'm kind of saying to them, yeah, that makes sense. The client doesn't understand the work that you've done and they're making a mistake here. So what's the priority? Do you know what I mean? Like, they're wrong. That's fair enough. Like, let's acknowledge that. And, what do you need to do? Maybe you need to go and have lunch and we could circle back to it afterwards when you've cleared your head or something. But if you're in a reasonable place to discuss it right now, let's think through what is important. What's at stake? Do we not want to lose this client? What's going to happen if we just end up agreeing to what they're asking for, that kind of thing? And even pausing and thinking about, well, what are the other options here? And what else might be at stake that's connected to this? I find that this often also then flows into the next tool that I use, which is sometimes called circles of influence or circle of control. If you can imagine, I'm using this in a training workshop. There's 3 circles, and in the middle circle represents you. And then the things that are closely connected to you are the things that you can control. So that inner circle is the circle of control. And then just outside of that is the circle of influence. These are the things that you can't actually fully control, but there might be something that you can do to sway things one way or the other. Like ultimately it's your boss who has to approve giving a discount to a client. So offering a discount might be something that's in the circle of influence. Whereas you calling and clarifying, well, what's the budget that the client has? That's something that would be in the control factor. What people often notice is that the things that are within their control usually are connected to what they say and what they do. Clarifying information, sharing information, rethinking the phrasing that they're using, changing the mode if it's been by email, picking up the phone or organizing a time to meet the person, that kind of thing. And then outside of that, the third circle in the diagram that sits outside of those two is the circle of, sometimes it's called acceptance or no control, or for me, I think it is something about acceptance, but what that means essentially is letting go of the craving and the aversion. It's not feeling angry and upset that this is how it is, even though it's so unfair and it's not right and they shouldn't be allowed to get away with it and it never should have happened. It's the moment when we lose that resentment or bitterness or rage or whatever it is that we might have been carrying. And then the other side of it, I think, is like distress, worry, rumination in terms of just almost a sense of panic sometimes that people might have, or intrusive thoughts, or just being on edge and they can't relax. I think that's another example of maybe your focus is shifting to these things that are outside of your control. So for both of those two areas, either you're upset that something's happened or you're worried that something's happening or has happened, there is in some situations not a whole lot that you can do about that. And for me, the way that I tend to approach this is from a compassionate place. I guess it's tempting when we're in that moment and we're obsessing about something that we can't do anything about right now, to beat ourselves up about it, to say, I'm overreacting, I'm so silly, I'm always so dramatic, what's wrong with me? Everyone else seems to just be able to get on with it, and here I am, really discombobulated and upset about a relatively minor thing. criticism, 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 and you can just imagine the cumulative effect of that. It's just yet another thing to feel guilty and to feel negative about. So for me, it's not okay. I don't want to continue to ruminate and obsess, but the reason why certainly makes sense. It's my brain's best effort to keep me safe. The reason why it operates this way makes sense. It's the process of evolution, and most of the threats that we've faced historically have been physical, like a bear attacking us. So we get ready for a physical response. But even the other things that push my buttons, like imagine we're living in a tribe and you say something stupid in front of everyone. Well, they're not going to share food with you. And it's not surprising that that's not a very good situation for your survival longer term. So we're programmed to want to avoid that. The way that we have emotions is that they're signals to us that help us to inform behavior, and they're often signals about our context. And so I can understand that anxiety or whatever it is that I'm feeling, it's my brain's interpretation of the situation that I'm in. And so in some situations, that's the best option. If there's someone following me back to my car and they're going to mug me and rob me and attack me or something, I'm glad that my brain and my body get me ready for a physical defense in that situation. There's nothing for me to do to override it, so to speak. But if I'm going for an exam or a job interview, or I'm going to ask someone out on a date, or it's an important meeting with a client, and I've got my stomach's bubbling and I feel on edge and I can't sit still and I'm short-breathed and I can feel my heart racing in my chest, I can interpret that signal and understand why, but there's particular steps that I need to do to manage it, which that often is where the shift comes back to the inner circle of control. Given all of that, what can I do and what do I need to do, in spite of the lack of influence that I might be able to have? So I hate the fact that my company has this policy, or this person I work with is not getting more support, or this client seems like a complete narcissist or whatever. I'd love to give them just a frontal lobotomy and a bit of a brain transplant or something. But barring that option presenting itself at some stage in the future, what do I need right now? And for me, it is often something like physically dealing with the buildup of stress, or it's something to do with my thoughts, like focusing on a more productive task, or blocking out time to do something, or maybe even distracting myself with something that I find a bit more fulfilling and enjoyable. But what works for you when you've been in those patterns where you've been ruminating and you kind of can't let go of things that you wish were different and they're not? I wonder if maybe we all actually end up with a slightly different mix of the behaviors or the strategies that end up working for us in those situations. Shoot me an email at podcast@simongood if there are particular strategies that do work for you, or even if this is an area that you'd like me to explore in more detail in a future episode of the podcast. So the next thing that I often consider when I'm analysing conflict are the 5 different types of conflict. I have explained these before, but if you're not familiar with them, the 5 types are data, interest, values, structure, and relationship. So say I'm dealing with conflict, I'm a team leader and one of my team keeps coming in late, for example. Well, there might be a data conflict component to that. That might be things like maybe the staff member's not aware of their starting time, but it might be things like they're not aware of how strictly it is upheld here. Like they think that it's not a big deal because their previous team leader let them get away with it. So the data clarification here might be letting them know that actually it's something that's important to you. It could be things like the impact of their behavior, like maybe sharing the problems that it's causing when, they're a bit late and clients arrive before the staff do, so they're waiting outside the front of the building or something like that. Or it might be talking to them about the data in terms of what's going to happen if the behavior doesn't change. Like, I just want you to know that if this happens again, I'll need to give you a formal warning or something. I think I'd probably put that in the data category. For example, if the person was breaking a rule that they might not be aware of, or they're at risk of a formal warning, but they might not be aware of it. But if I'm using that formal warning as a way of putting pressure on them to change their behavior, I think that's probably the next type of conflict, which is interest conflict. Interest conflict in its simplest form could be understood of what I want versus what you want, my interest versus your interests. And when we're dealing with interest conflict, these are mutually exclusive. So part of the challenge with this type of conflict is that there's no magic wand that we can wave. They need more sleep, and so they want to sleep in, and it means that they're late for work. or they've got young kids that they're managing and it's not always easy to get them in the car and off to preschool on time. Or maybe they've got a relative at home that they're caring for, or it's the bus schedule of where they live and they can't afford to move closer to the office. Like there'll be these kind of factors which are potentially driving anyway, that lateness in behavior. And the thing about interest conflict is that they're not wrong. Like that's perfectly understandable that the person would want to look after their kids and manage finances and, want more sleep. And it's not so much that it's not valid or it's not right. It's usually an acknowledgement of the fact that although that's something that's important to them, there are also things that are important to you. And in an issue like lateness, it might be factors like the impact that it's causing on clients or other members of the team, or maybe it's just a value that you hold, that it's not professional or it's not right, and you don't want that to lead to a slippage in behavior from other staff. So that could be an interest for you, is that you're wanting to maintain consistency in terms of what's expected and tolerated within the team. So usually the best strategy for dealing with interest conflict is to name both sides. It does sound like challenging. I appreciate where you're coming from, that you've got the issues with parenting to manage. At the same time, when you're late to work, this is the issue that it's causing. So that's not something that can continue moving forward. And then you can decide how to deal with it from there. You might, in some situations, take a very firm competing approach. I just want you to know that if it happens again, that I'll be issuing you with a formal warning, or I might need to consider a formal warning. Or I just want to be clear that even though I can understand where you're coming from, it's not something where there's some flexibility in on our end. It's not negotiable. So we don't need to be harsh or abrupt or mean, but it is saying, I'm not going to budge. But maybe it's not a big deal to you in this situation. And maybe, you letting the person walk in 5 or 10 minutes late upon reflection is just not the end of the world. So it might make more sense to take that more accommodating kind of approach. This is why it's so important to have paused and consider your goal and the ongoing relationship with the person. How important is it to you to keep them happy? Or how willing are you to disappoint them or annoy them or whatever else it might be? So it's usually naming both sides and then setting up a conversation like, how are we going to figure this out? But what can be really helpful for you is to have decided ahead of time how assertive you want to be. And you could almost walk in with a bit of a starting strategy and then a fallback, like you hope they'll agree to this, but you're willing to compromise to this if that's the situation that you're in. So we've got data conflict and interest conflict. Values conflict is often the worldview values that we have. Like you might think that it's part of being a professional staff member to show up on time, or it's a respectful relationship with your boss to send them a message if you're going to be more than 5 minutes late. But this is just a value that you've developed. There's nothing written on the wall, unless there is a set of rules written on the wall, that says this is right. People use phrases like common sense or respectful or professional, but what they're actually talking about is their subjective interpretation of what's respectful and what's professional and what should happen, right? It's just in the moment they tend to think about things in a more black and white way, especially if they're becoming worked up and escalated. So values conflict here could be how they consider the lateness, for example, or it might even be something like how they consider the lateness in the mix of the other priorities. Like maybe the staff member can't believe what an uncaring and unsupportive manager they have, who would drag them over the coals and grill them for being less than 10 minutes late when they know that they have young kids. So that's a value that the staff member might have. To be frank, I think that one's a perfectly valid value as well. And I certainly think that there would be a lot of people that feel that way. But it's usually not helpful to just continue the Groundhog Day repetition talking about the data, or just to negotiate and talk about the interests if underneath it is this values difference. Usually that's often about the discussion. Like it seems like this is your value. I just want to be transparent that I come from a different place on this. This is my perspective. We don't necessarily need to agree around, the values and the subjective kind of elements, but what would be helpful is to get on the same page moving forward in terms of expectations of behavior. So that's often the best way to deal with that values type of conflict, is to name both sides and then again set up that solution-focused conversation. Structural conflict is often caused by the way that decisions get made or the way that communication happens. So especially if you're noticing recurring issues involving conflict coming up, it might be connected to the underlying structural factors. The way that people's roles relate to each other, or the onboarding process that you use with clients, or the clauses that are in the contract around liquidated damages or cancellations or non-compete or whatever else it might be. So those could also be structural elements, like what's confirmed in writing versus a verbal conversation, which level of decision maker are brought in for what kind of issue. And when we're dealing with conflict, a lot of the time changing the structure means that we can avoid some of the potential problems that come up and minimize the amount of headaches and dramas that we encounter. And then the final type of conflict is relationship conflict. This is the emotional kind of stuff that builds up as a result of the reciprocal patterns between the people. They do this and it pushes your buttons, and so you respond in kind. It's the knee-jerk reaction. It's that desire to say, I bloody told you so. I told you this would happen and you didn't listen to me. That's relationship conflict. The two staff who refuse to say hello to each other, and they talk about the other person having a giant stick up their butt and they describe the other person in a similar way. That's relationship conflict. It's the people who give each other the silent treatment. It's that stupid look on your face, and would you not use that bloody tone in your voice? It's all of those kind of things. Now, that type of conflict can be more difficult to deal with, especially if you're in a management or leadership position. Sometimes what I often suggest is describing the behaviors. Like, what's the pattern of actual behavior? They hate each other, or they don't have much trust or whatever, but what are they actually doing? Because that often helps us to identify the options for dealing with it. If the team meetings are the place where everything goes off the rails and it never works, then changing the structure or having more senior people or less people in the room, or there would be an endless number of options for fixing it. But first we need to figure out, where is that relationship conflict manifesting in terms of the actual behavior? So those are the 5 types of conflict: the data, interest, structure, values, and relationship. And in any conflict situation that you're dealing with, there might be a few of them contributing. Actually, I think a lot of the time, all 5 of them are probably present. And it doesn't necessarily matter where you start. I often suggest with senior leaders like directors or general managers, if you notice that there's relationship conflict coming up, it can be a bit like the tip of the iceberg. So you notice it first, but I recommend dealing with it last, because, taking 2 people out for lunch and doing some team building or whatever, it's not going to solve the problem if underneath it there's an issue with, the contract that's used to engage this person as a contractor or something else similar. That would be better to deal with first and fix the structural and the data problems. And then you might find that the relationship issues end up sorting themselves out as you go. The next tool that you would often use is something at the individual level, some type of a personality test. And I know a lot of organizations favor these, and you might have even done training or attended seminars around these personality profiles. There's popular ones like Myers-Briggs type indicator, or DISC personality type's a popular one in workplaces. The Big 5 personality factors is one of the most empirically validated ones. It's the one that I actually tend to prefer when I'm doing conflict resolution training. But I've noticed that a number of organizations recently are using this one called Insight Discovery, and I actually quite like it. With that model, the personalities are broken down into 4 different colors: the red, the yellow, the green, and the blue. So in the red type of personality, you'd get those very business-like, results-oriented people. They like to be in control. They like you to be brief. And what they're triggered by is losing control. So if you're dealing with a red person, don't send them the full document as an attachment. Just put it as a dot point list in the email itself. Organize a time to talk them through issues if you're worried that, it's going to be put into the too hard basket. And give them an update. Like, don't give them that, there's bad news and I'm not going to tell you what it is. That's the kind of thing that's really going to set the reds off. The yellows are different. The yellows are often very collaborative and influential. They tend to be creative. They really like discussion. They like to have input. They like to have a say. So say you're dealing with a situation and there's a client that's upset about something that's happened in a project that you're doing with them. The red client would want something different to the yellow client. The yellow client might appreciate you setting up a meeting and inviting their input and organizing a time to discuss it and collaborate together so that you can all get on the same page and come up with the most robust solution possible. Whereas the red person would want to know, look, we've taken this action in the short term. This is what we're planning medium term. This is what's longer term. This is the update. This is the chance for you to provide input, that kind of thing. It's like, I just want you to know that things are moving in the right direction and it's under control. Whereas the yellow person is like, we're giving you the opportunity for input, we're giving you information, we're making sure that you feel connected and you've got your finger on the pulse, that kind of thing. Same if there's conflict happening within your team. The red kind of team members, they probably just want to know who's meant to be doing what. Whereas the yellow team members might want closure about something that's happened, or they really want to look at things at a high level to make sure that they're not going to run into this problem down the track, and they want to feel like there's more of a robust, integrated, holistic solution versus just putting a Band-Aid on it. I mean, so they're probably looking at some type of a process or some type of an action that you can offer them to give them that assurance. The green personalities are like the glue that holds the team together. They're very social, harmonious people. They like to be liked. They like small talk. They like to ask how your kids were or how the holiday was, that kind of liked. And if we're dealing with conflict with greens, we really want to spend more time smoothing the relationship, de-escalating. They don't like confrontation. They don't like insensitivity. So we'll need to slow down, give them a chance to have their say, let them talk about things that they're upset about before we jump straight into the problem solving kind of stuff. And then you've got the cool blue personalities that you might come across, the very detail and information oriented people. They tend to look at situations involving problems from a problem solving lens. They're wanting to come up with some options, go through the detail, look at all the factors involved, and then make decisions. So for these people, when you're communicating with them, they want you to be precise. It was this amazing light bulb moment for me when I realized that I'm a yellow and my wife is a blue, and I just want to make decisions spontaneously. But gosh, what an incredible benefit there might be from me spending 15 minutes sitting down and coming up with a plan that we're going to use for our upcoming holiday versus just figuring it out off a whim like I want to do. It reassured the blue person. It let her know that I was paying attention and taking it seriously, and eased some of, I think, the underlying anxiety of, we're spending all this money, what if we don't optimally use our time, or we miss out on things because we weren't aware that they're only offered on certain days or something like that. So the reds, the business-like people, the results-oriented, the yellows, the influential, discussion-based, the greens, the social, harmonious, they want to feel like everything's okay. They just want to go to work and do their job, and they don't want dramas and headaches and stress and tension. Or the blues, the detail-oriented, people that you might come across, each of them will resonate with different things. And what we don't want to do is make the mistake of assuming that everybody thinks the way that we do. They don't. All of the different people that you'll come across, they're literally all unique, so they've all got a different way of thinking. But even looking at themes or trends, or, maybe in your situation, there's a different mix of personalities that you come across. Some people want to focus on the money, and that's the only thing that they care about. Whereas others, it's more about the ongoing relationship, or they value their ego getting massaged a little bit. Are they the kind of person that wants a lot of updates and a heads up ahead of time? Or maybe that causes them stress and you're more likely to end up with additional work going down that route. Just thinking on a case-by-case or relationship-by-relationship basis about who it is that you're dealing with helps us then to develop more of a flexible and I think ultimately strategic way of responding. So we've talked about the self-check-in, the self-regulation steps if needed, followed by assessing the goal, thinking through those steps of the circle of control and circle of influence, analysing the 5 types of conflict, and then looking at the different individual personality factors that are involved. The final step for me is thinking about something that's called conflict modes or conflict styles. This is based on some early writings by Thomas and Kilman, a couple of psychologists. And their theory was basically that we've got these 5 different ways of dealing with any conflict situation that we're in: competing, collaborating, compromising, avoid, and accommodate. Compete, collaborate, compromise, avoid, and accommodate. I always remember them because there's 3 C words and 2 A words, if that's at all helpful for you as a bit of a memory jog. So competing is when we're firm, we hold the line, we say no if the person's asking us to do something, or we insist on asking them to do something. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're aggressive or rude or harsh, but we stick to our guns. Compromise is like meeting in the middle. I'm not 100% happy with it, but I can agree to it. If we compromise, nobody gets 100% of what they want, but at least you can reach an agreement and then move on. Accommodating is when we give the other person what they're asking for. Like just say yes if it's a client that's got a request for a variation or something, and even though it's not technically within the original scope, we just decide to approve it anyway. Avoiding, obviously, is when we choose not to engage with the conflict. You might see something happen that shouldn't, or a negative comment's made, but this isn't the time and place to deal with it, so at least right now we let it go. And then the final option that we've got is collaborating. This is where we kind of sit down and see if we can come up with a win-win option. So in their research, their premise was that if you've got a level of emotional intelligence, you probably use all 5 of these different conflict modes or conflict styles. Sometimes you stick to your guns and you're firm. In other situations, it makes sense to take an accommodating kind of approach. Sometimes that win-win is really important, and it's like you do want to make sure that the client's happy but not give away something that's important to you. Sometimes it's better just to get to an agreement quickly, and so compromising would make sense. We probably use all 5 of these different styles, but their idea was that we go back to one when we're at our worst, when you haven't had much sleep or you're under the pump and really busy or stressed. You might have a default that you slip into. For me, I think it's probably collaborating. I'm stubborn, so I don't like backing down, but I'm a bit of a people pleaser, so I like to also make sure that, my clients are happy or whatever. And there's been a number of situations in my career and in my business life where that's caused me problems. Like, I wish that I'd just been more firm and said, no, I'm not going to do what you're asking me to do. Or I'm happy to do it. This is the additional cost, like just being firm. In other situations, I wish I'd just compromised. In hindsight, it wasn't such a big deal. I could have just said yes, and it would have meant we didn't risk losing that client because there was this small issue up in the air. And certainly there are situations where I should have been more accommodating and just said yes and just agreed to something and put on a happy face instead of, my petulant childish tantrum that I still seem to be able to be having in my 40s around something that I'm not happy with. Can't I just go with the flow? Like so many situations, I think I've ended up creating extra conflict and unnecessary drama that I've ended up having to deal with. And there's many situations where we should have avoided conflict. You don't actually need to get sucked into every conflict that you're invited to. It's almost like a party. You don't need to take every invitation that you're given, right? So we've got these 5 different conflict modes. It can be helpful for you to be aware of what your default might be, because depending on the situation, any of these 5 options might be ideal. As I said, sometimes it's better to take that competing approach. Sometimes it's better to collaborate, sometimes to compromise, etc. And you will also be dealing with people who have a default style. So if you're dealing with someone who's a natural competitor, a very demanding, high expectation, entitled kind of client or staff member, maybe you need to be a bit firm and hold the line early on. I often find that it's easier to be assertive and establish your authority and then gradually relax it over time. Whereas if you're too accommodating and too flexible early on, it can be difficult then to ratchet up the level of assertiveness. I think it's one of the main problems with taking either the accommodating kind of approach or the collaborating approach is that the person that we're dealing with might develop a bit of an unrealistic expectation, I guess you'd say, an unrealistic precedent that this is the way it was in the past, and so then they expect the same thing next time. So just being aware of these and pausing and thinking about those other 5 factors that I've mentioned can help us then to develop a plan. And in effect, these 5 conflict modes could represent the 5 options that you've got, generally speaking. What would avoiding look like, and what are the pros and cons of that? What would competing look like? What's the best phrasing for that? What's the best way to do that? Who should do it? Should you do it by email, in a meeting, whatever? What would a compromise look like? Are there things that you can give away, and what are the actual core and essential interests that you need from them, and what are the things that are not as important or relatively lower priority? If you did accommodate, where would that leave you? What are the benefits of that in terms of the positive ongoing relationship? What are the potential risks there of precedent or that kind of thing? And then what would that collaborating approach look like? What would a win-win truly be? What do you think the client's actually looking for? As well as money, what are the other factors that are important to them? And as well as money, what are the other factors that are important to you? And then thinking about how all of those different bits and pieces fit together. It's not so much that you can see what that win-win solution might be, but I suppose you should at least be confident that there's a chance that you could get there, but you have a sense that both parties are willing to make a genuine effort to collaborate. I think the times when that collaborating approach goes wrong is when either it's not a realistic situation, like there's no way this was ever going to be a win-win. Like there's a $20,000 payment, something's gone wrong, someone's going to be paying the cost of that. If there are other factors that are involved, there's an ongoing relationship, sure, you could talk about the next project they're working on, or finishing up some other work as part of this extra $20,000, or some other option for, instead of giving it in cash, some other kind of payment. But if you're never going to see them again and there's no ongoing relationship, that might not be a situation where sitting down and collaborating makes sense. Maybe it's the compromise. Look, it's $20,000. What if we offer you 10? Is that something you could live with? Or you take the competing approach of, no, it's not our fault, we're not paying, or just accommodating, send us the invoice and we'll get it sorted. So how does that sit with you, thinking about those steps of the conflict analysis toolkit as I've just described it? The self-perception to begin with, the second step of thinking about your goal and the priorities and maybe ranking those, the third step, that circle of control tool, the fourth step, thinking about the types of conflict and what factors are driving it. The fifth step would be the individual personality differences, that insight discovery or some other type of personality inventory, etc., if there's something else that you're already familiar with. And then finally thinking about those 5 conflict modes: compete, accommodate, collaborate, avoid. How does that sit with you? Is it something that resonates? Does it match, generally speaking, the approach that you normally take to deal with conflict? And maybe I'm just phrasing it and structuring it in a way that's slightly different. Or maybe there's new things that you want to take and I guess additions that could put into the toolkit as you're going into the next situation that you're dealing with. Either way, I certainly hope that it has been useful for you. If it has, I would love it if you would give a positive review. That's just so incredibly helpful at the moment of a relatively young and growing podcast. It just sends a signal to the algorithm that it's useful. But I read the comments and the feedback and stuff that comes too. So I have to say it's also really useful for me to find out the bits and pieces that resonate. If you'd like to give feedback directly, you can shoot me an email. It's podcast@simongood.com. If you're interested in my training workshops or the other things that I do, I'm gradually updating that website and putting a bit more detail on there over the next couple of weeks. And otherwise, thank you very much for listening. All the best dealing with the conflict situations that you encounter over the next week or two. And I hope to see you again in a future episode of the Conflict Skills Podcast. Bye for now.